The first game is number 3 TCU against number 2 Michigan. Michigan undefeated at 13-0, coming off a really big win against Purdue in their Big Ten championship game. TCU, on the other hand, coming off of a loss against Kansas State in their Big 12 championship game, and they are, I think they're 12-1 now.
12-1, yeah.
I need to sneeze. Okay. So, TCU. Actually, I have the things right here. TCU, Michigan. TCU coming in as the underdogs. They're plus 250 on the money line. The spread, they're supposed to lose by 8 points, and the over-under is at 58.5. A lot of controversy with this game, as a lot of people feel that TCU shouldn't be the third rank, as they lost their last game of the season, and they were the third rank when they lost. So at least drop a space so that, you can allow for teams that won games or at least didn't lose games to kind of jump into that spot. But that didn't happen. So against Michigan, heavy favorites. Do you think they lose this game?
I think Michigan's gonna win this game. I think this game is gonna be the bigger blowout out of the two. I think it's gonna be a higher. I think that Michigan's gonna win by a lot.
Yeah.
Um, TCU is not going to be able to score as much against Michigan as they have against the other Big 12 teams that they faced. And TCU has started off games very slowly. And I think if you get behind Michigan, you're not going to come back because they can run you to death.
Yeah.
So Michigan's going to win this game. It's about how many that they're going to win by. Um, I think they're definitely going to cover the 7.5. I think that Michigan is going to win this game pretty big. I think it might be like 42-17 or 42-24. I think it's gonna be a pretty
Yeah.
big blowout. So I'm gonna take Michigan. I'm gonna take the over, and I'm gonna take Michigan covering the spread.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do think that the other playoff game is going to be the more of a
Closer game,
blowout.
yeah. You
Um
do?
Yeah, I think it's gonna be. I think, yeah, we'll get into that. But for
Okay,
this
okay.
one, I do think this will still be a blowout. To be fair, I think both
Uh-huh.
games will be blowouts because I think it's so unevenly mismatched, and this is why we need something like a 12-team playoff, because just having the four makes absolutely no sense, because it's like we already know who's gonna win before we even start. It would be a miracle if any of the underdogs actually won the game.
Yeah, it's a
So,
little different. Yeah.
yeah, I'm going to go with Michigan. I'm going to go with the over 58.5 points. I think it can easily be done. 8 points is so generous towards TCU. They aren't even going to get within 20 points of Michigan. So, yeah, I hate the fact that TCU is in the playoffs right now. They do not deserve this spot whatsoever. And I know there's a lot of bad blood between TCU and Oregon, especially when it comes to the college football playoff, because the first year that it happened, Oregon jumped TCU
Yeah.
in the 3 spot in order to, excuse me, in order to make it to the playoffs, beat Florida State, but then lose to Ohio State. So, I know some of you might be thinking, oh, well, you're just biased because of that. But now TCU actually get their opportunity. And it's like, but yeah, but it's not deserved at all. Like, at all. They lost to a
Well, okay,
team.
okay, okay, pause. It is deserved for them to make the playoff. They didn't deserve to not make the playoff after their season. They went 12-0. They lost in the conference championship game but they lost by 3 points on a last second field goal, and they were about to score a touchdown. They were an inch away from scoring a touchdown to win the game. So they do deserve to make the playoff. I totally disagree that they don't deserve to make the playoff. I just think that there's a big difference between deserving to make the playoff and actually being good enough to compete in the playoff. Alabama and TCU on a neutral field, Alabama would beat them by 15 or 20 points. It's just
Yeah,
that Alabama doesn't deserve to make the playoff because they lost 2 games. You don't deserve to make the playoff after losing 2 games.
I understand.
And
I understand. I understand the fact that you look at the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 teams and you
no
go,
one
yeah,
else deserves to
obviously
go in.
there's no one else to go in. But that is not despite the fact that TCU deserves to lose to a team that they already beat by 10 points on their home field, but then stay in their position. Because think about it. I understand, like,
They stayed at 3. They stayed at 3 because the college football playoff committee did not want Ohio State Michigan rematch in the semifinal. That is the
that's
only
why.
reason they stayed at 3. And
That is
that's the
the
problem with the
problem that
college
I
football
have.
playoff. Yes, that is the problem with the college football playoff because there's no reason that Ohio State Ohio State had like they were undefeated. They lost to Michigan at home, but they have a better loss than TCU,
Mm,
and they didn't lose their last game. And it doesn't really make sense that people are gonna say, well, TCU did the regular season undefeated, but like
yeah,
I don't know. Ohio State's definitely a more complete team than TCU.
yeah.
Ohio State and Michigan was close for most of the game, and then Michigan pulled away at the end.
The running game,
Um,
like you said,
that running game, but
you've got Corum going like absolutely ham on Ohio State's
absolutely,
defense.
absolutely ham. But like, I think that, yeah, I think that as we said before, I think Michigan's gonna win that game, pretty big margin. Now we need to get into Ohio State, Georgia, because I think we feel a little bit different about this one. I feel like you think that Ohio State's gonna get absolutely romped by Georgia because Georgia isn't the best
Yes,
team in the country. I do
yes.
not think that Ohio State's going to get rocked. I think that this is actually be a relatively close game. I think that Georgia has had a good year this year. They're not as good as they were last year.
No,
They,
Georgia are not as good as they are last year, but Ohio State are
yeah,
a lot worse than they were last year.
I do not agree with that. I think they're better than they were last year. They didn't even make the playoff last year. This year they
I
have Marvin
understand.
Harrison Jr. They have a better defense this year, and Marvin Harrison Jr. is the best wide receiver in college football by such a long margin that's like insane. He's amazing. He's going to get drafted in the top 15 of the draft next year, and that's the only
Yeah,
reason he's not higher is because in the NFL you don't draft receivers and running backs that high.
yeah,
But Marvin Harrison Jr. is a stud. Their offense is really good. They have a lot of good receivers and stuff. They had a bad game against Michigan. I think they played badly. I think that going into that game, they felt like they were heavy favorites. They thought they were going to win, and they didn't really take Michigan seriously enough. I think that Ohio State is going to keep this one relatively close, and the only reason I say that is because they can score. I just don't think Georgia's offense is that dynamic. I know that Stetson Bennett has had a good year, but it's not really Stetson Bennett. It's that they have five-star running backs, five-star wide receivers, five-star O linemen, five-star tight ends.
yeah,
I just
exactly.
don't think.
Well,
I think that Georgia's a good
how
team.
can you bet against that?
I think that they're going to win. I think Georgia's going to win. I'm
Yeah,
not saying
but
that.
how can you say with the defense that we've seen Ohio State have, not only have we seen Ohio State, we've seen Ohio State's defense against a top tier team like Michigan this year,
Yeah,
right? We've seen it at home with the backing of their own fans,
they had a
and they
bad
still
game.
got blown out by 20. All Georgia
They
needs to do is
no,
run the
no,
goddamn ball and
no,
they're
no, no.
fine.
That whole narrative that's being like pushed around that Ohio State was so much worse than Michigan is just not true.
It
They
is
were
true.
down. It's not true at all. They were up the whole first half. Then Michigan took the lead. Ohio State in that game against Michigan gave up 4 75-yard touchdowns. Four.
Yeah,
Four.
because
So
that's
so
what
just so
makes
just
the
pause,
better
pause, pause,
team.
pause. No, no, that does not make the better team. It's like what happened, and it does not make the better team at all. That was a fluky game. If Ohio State and Michigan played another 100 times, Michigan would not win that much, like by that much of a margin. Those are two very evenly matched teams. I think that was totally a total. That was the kind of a fluke. I think that Michigan's still a very good team, but I can't definitively say that Michigan's a better team than Ohio State if they played again.
Wow.
I don't think I can say that. I think that Ohio State's offense is very good, and I don't think that Michigan's offense is as dynamic. I know JJ McCarthy has had a very good year and their running game is insane. They don't have Blake Corum, so they don't even have their starting running back. Their second running back has like a broken hand and he has like he has to wear a club. But I think that Michigan deserves to be number two. But as we saw last year by everyone's hyping up Michigan, they played Georgia, they got thumped. They got thumped by Georgia. They lost by 30 points. It wasn't a close game. Everyone knew it wasn't a close game. I feel like that was a total mismatch, and that's why everyone says that they have to have SEC teams in the playoff because when Michigan plays against these good teams in the SEC, they never perform well. I do think they're going to beat TCU because TCU is not as good as everyone thinks they are, but I think that Ohio
Mhm.
State's going to keep the Georgia game close. Georgia did dominate Tennessee, but I just think that Ohio State's offense is a little less reliant on their quarterback than Tennessee's is, and
Are you joking?
I think no, Tennessee's offense is 100% Hendon Hooker. Ohio State's
Y-
offense is less than 100%, but
Yeah,
CJ Stroud is
maybe
important.
less than 100%, maybe
A
like
little,
95%.
they're still very reliant on CJ Stroud. I totally agree. I just think that Ohio State has a better running game than
Oh
Tennessee.
my
I don't know if
God.
Travion Henderson's going to play. I think Ohio State is going to keep this relatively close. I think it's going to be within 10 points. Um,
Wow.
I just think that as we saw like a few years ago, Clemson played Ohio State and Ohio State thumped them, just absolutely thumped them. And the only team that Ohio State lost to that year was when they lost to Alabama, who had the best offense in the country by far. Georgia's offense is not as scary as everyone makes it seem. The reason they score a lot of points is because their defense. their defense is the best in the country by far, which is the reason they score a lot of points because they hold teams, they get good field position, they run the ball, they get turnovers. I just think that Ohio State's going to be able to score some points. I gotta say, it's like it kind of reminds me of that Alabama Florida game in the SEC championship game a few years ago, where like Florida had like a good offense and they were just able to go score for score, and they lost to Alabama by a touchdown, but they were just able to maintain it a little bit. I think Georgia's going to win. I think that they might even cover. I think that Georgia might even cover and win by a touchdown, but I don't think it's going to be more than 10 points. I think Ohio State's going to keep it close, and I think I think it's going to go. With that being said, I think it's going to go for the under. I think it's going to go under 62. And Ohio State's defense is actually pretty good. Like they had a bad game against Michigan, a terrible game against Michigan, but those are all 75-yard plays. If they didn't score those plays, Michigan couldn't methodically drive the ball down the field. The only reason they were scoring those touchdowns was because they got a 75-yard pass from JJ McCarthy, 75-yard pass. We've seen Michigan's offense be totally anemic this year against Illinois. I mean, they barely beat Illinois at home. They had trouble with Maryland. I mean, Michigan has played one very good team and one decent team.
Yeah.
So I just don't think that it's fair to say that I think that Michigan is going to win and Georgia's going to win, and we're going to have a Georgia-Michigan championship, which we could talk about in a second. But I just don't think it's fair to say that Ohio State's going to get destroyed by Georgia. They might. I just think that last year, if we look at it like this, last year Georgia played Michigan in the first round and they destroyed them, and that was a better Georgia team, and that Michigan team last year. I know they beat Ohio State last year at home, but it was a close game the whole time. This year, Ohio State's better than they were last year. I think
got
that
blown out in the horseshoe. Yeah. And it's a better Ohio State team, according to you.
When everyone says blown out, I don't think it's rational to say they got blown out.
They did.
It was 31-23 with 7 minutes left. That's a one-possession game.
It doesn't. Michigan came in and looked like the better team the entire game. Had they won by 15, 12, 7, Ohio State looked like they got blown out.
Okay. Let's say it's like it kind of reminds me the Ohio State Michigan game of the UCLA Oregon game. I think that Oregon's a better team than UCLA this year, but Oregon had everything go right for them in that game. They scored touchdown after touchdown after touchdown after touchdown.
Yes.
All perfect. What happened when they didn't do that? They lost to Oregon State, they lost to Utah, and they lost to Washington.
We didn't lose to Utah?
They didn't lose to Utah, but they almost lost to Utah, and then they lost to Washington. They lost to 3 teams. And they should not have lost those games. They should not have lost those games.
That's what happens. That's what happens. That's what happens with every team. That's what happens with every team. If all the pieces fit, you're gonna do well. That's the formula.
Last year, Georgia was undefeated last year. They play Alabama in the SEC championship. They lose by 20 to Alabama. Then they play them 2 weeks later, and they beat them in the championship.
Yeah, because
that's how college works. It doesn't. If you play the same, if Ohio State plays Michigan in the national championship, I'm picking Ohio State 10 out of 10. 10 out of 10. Michigan is not beating Ohio State again. I'm sorry, they're just not doing it. They're not.
They are though. They are. They would. Look, okay. Here.
After Ohio State lost to them, no shot.
Okay,
Ohio State would beat them.
Here's what I turn you to before we talk about the final, right? Here's the last thing I'm going to point out, right? Let's look at so Georgia has won 13 games this season, right? 13 games. Haven't lost one. And these are all games, majority games against SEC teams, right?
Okay, but those SEC teams have not been the top tier SEC teams. Those are
I understand
SEC, that's the look. Okay, let's look at Georgia's schedule. They absolutely thumped Oregon. We understand that. They thumped Oregon.
Yeah.
Then they beat Samford, not Stanford.
Yeah,
Samford.
Doesn't matter.
They beat South Carolina 48-7 in the third game of the year, but it's a different team than South Carolina is now. They did beat them 48-7, but it was the third game of the year versus now. It's the same thing as Oregon having the argument that they're better at the end of the year than the beginning of the year. You know that's true. Don't even argue. Don't even try to deny it. It's a fact. South Carolina now would not lose 48-7 to Georgia. They just wouldn't. I'm sorry, they wouldn't.
No, they wouldn't. You're right. They wouldn't lose 48-7 to Georgia. But it's all about a thing of figuring out
48-31.
It's all about the capability. It's all about the capability that the team has. We know that South Carolina are capable to beat the best teams in the SEC, as we've seen, right?
Yeah.
And their stats are still going to be the same stats at the end of the season. So if they're only completing like 30% of their passes at the end of the year, but throughout the year, they start completing 70% of their passes and they end with like 60% of their passes completed. They will end on the statistic that they completed 60% of their passes. So Georgia, let's say that South Carolina finished with a 60% passing rate, they would have beat a South Carolina with a 60% passing rate because at the beginning of the year, everyone is still figuring out. And a 48, an absolute blowout like that, 48, especially in South Carolina, a 48-7 win like that is huge. It's
Okay,
huge.
I agree. But let's look at this. So they beat Kent State. They beat Missouri by 4. I don't think anyone in this conversation thinks Missouri is a better team than
Yeah, but
Oregon
they
or
played
South
in
Carolina.
Missouri. They played in
They played in
Missouri.
they played in South Carolina. They played
Yeah,
in
and
South Carolina.
they did well against South Carolina, but at the time, South Carolina were not a good team. Missouri have
Okay,
always been a decent team. They were
okay. So you're
better
admitting
than South
so you're
Carolina at this
so you're
point in the
admitting that
season.
so you're admitting that Georgia has had a relatively easy schedule. They played Auburn, not a good team. Vanderbilt, terrible team. Florida, not a good team. Tennessee was a good team, but they were on the
Auburn,
Tennessee at that
Vanderbilt,
point.
Florida, Tennessee, Mississippi State, Kentucky, even Georgia Tech
Mississippi
and
State.
LSU are all good teams.
No, the only good teams that they played this year were LSU in the final game and Tennessee. Those are two. They played two good teams this year. Oh, and three, Oregon. They played three good teams this year. Oregon, the first game was a fluke. If Oregon played Georgia today, I don't think they lose 49-3. I think everyone agrees that. I think that would be a 49 to like 20 or 30 game. And I just don't feel like Georgia this year is clearly, clearly not as good as they were last year. And last year, they barely beat Alabama in the championship. Barely. The reason that they lost, Alabama lost two of their wide receivers to torn ACLs during that game. That was a very close game. Bryce Young threw the pick six at the end of the game to seal it, but it was a very close game. And Alabama, the whole time you felt like Alabama was going to get that touchdown to win the game, but then Bryce Young threw the pick and the game was over and Georgia won. Georgia's a good team. I'm not going to deny that, but to tell me that they're going to repeat, has any team ever repeated in the playoff era? I don't think any team's repeated in the playoff era. I think it's always
No.
1-1. I don't think any team is repeated in the playoff era. It's going to be tough for them to
Yes.
repeat. I think that they've had a very easy schedule. Everyone says, oh, SEC, SEC, SEC. But like, even against Tennessee, they dominated Tennessee. They only scored 27 points. If I don't care how much you're dominating a team, if you only score 27 points, you can't beat them by that much. You can only beat them by 27. It's not like if
They
you score
were
50
ranked
points.
first in the nation.
What are they ranked now?
First. Oh,
No.
Tennessee?
Tennessee.
Yeah, Tennessee's like what, 6 now because they're a one-man team. As soon as you lose Hendon Hooker, you're screwed.
Okay, but they had Hendon Hooker in that game.
They did, and they beat them 27-13.
Georgia is the best team in the country the whole year. I totally understand that.
Uh-huh.
I just don't think that they're gonna walk in the park and just romp Ohio State. Ohio State has just as many 5 stars as Georgia's does. Ohio State has just as many 5 stars as Georgia's does. They have a better quarterback. They have better wide receivers. They just have the level of players is the same. Their coach is a better scheme. He schemes better. The only reason that Georgia's going to win this game is they have a way better defense. They have a way better defense. That's the reason they're going to win the game. Their defense is full of 5 stars that are super athletic. They move side to side very quickly and they tackle well. That's the reason that they're going to win this game. But I could easily see in the Ohio State Georgia game being like 30-31 to 27. Like it can be a close game. It can be a close game.
Wow.
If Ohio State plays well, they can beat anyone in the country. They might not play well. They might not.
Yeah. But the thing is that majority of the time they don't play well.
But if they haven't played well the whole year in these games, maybe they're due for a good game.
You want to talk about an easy schedule? Look at Ohio State's schedule.
Ohio State's schedule and Georgia's schedule have both been very easy. I'm not going to deny it. I'm not going to say they both.
Georgia's been a little bit hard. Georgia, okay,
a little hard. A little bit hard. Yes.
Georgia have played the top 5 of the top 6 teams, or 5 of the top 7. No, 5 of the top 6 teams, not including them in the SEC. Yes, in the SEC,
they didn't play Alabama.
No, but they played Mississippi State, Kentucky.
Those teams are terrible.
Tennessee, South Carolina. So they played 4.
No.
They
play
Tennessee.
Look
at the East. Look at the East. It goes Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina, Kentucky. All teams they played. Look at the West. LSU, Mississippi State, Alabama. They didn't play Alabama, sure, but Alabama has been brutal this year.
They played all those good teams early in the year when they weren't as good as they are now.
No, they didn't.
So
They
like
played Mississippi State and Kentucky's third
Mississippi
and
State's
second to
not that
last game of the
good.
season. They played LSU in the
Mississippi
championship.
State's barely ranked. Mississippi State's barely ranked.
But
Oregon State is ranked higher
they're
than Mississippi State.
third.
State,
Oh my
Oregon
God.
State.
Oregon State doesn't have to play LSU,
I
Alabama,
agree.
South Carolina, Tennessee on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think that
Of
in the
course they're going to be.
SEC,
Of course they're going to be higher ranked. Mississippi State can't compete with the other SEC teams. If Oregon State was in the
yeah,
SEC team, could you imagine?
they
They
wouldn't
wouldn't
win
win a
that many games.
game.
They wouldn't win that
They
many
wouldn't win a
games.
game. Period.
No,
Not even that many
no.
games. They wouldn't win a game.
Okay, but like some of these games like that you're hyping up for Georgia, like Missouri, like they barely beat. That was a terrible performance.
But that was at Missouri. Missouri's
They can
environment.
be beat. They can be beat.
Yeah, no,
Georgia can
they
be
were
beat.
beat. They were beat.
No. Like they can lose. Georgia can lose.
Yeah, of course Georgia can lose. But you look at, I mean, like, yes, there are a lot of teams in the SEC this year
Okay,
that
I have
have
a
really
question for
stunk it
you.
up.
I have a question for you. If USC made the fourth spot,
Yes.
what do you think would happen against Georgia?
Against
What do you think?
against Georgia,
Yeah,
I feel like it would be a closer game than Ohio State, Georgia. I think USC,
I think it's a good argument.
a
Yeah,
healthy Caleb Williams, it would be a closer game than Ohio State, Georgia. That's why I have such a big issue with TCU staying 3 and USC dropping all the way to what they're like 8 now or
10.
10? They're 10?
10.
Jesus. Dropping all the way to 10. That's
Yeah.
why I have such a big issue with it. Because if, like you said, they didn't want Ohio State to be the 3 seed and TCU to be the 4 seed, because honestly, that's a business decision. They don't want Michigan and Ohio State rematch in the college football semifinal.
Yeah.
So why not keep that trend? Have USC stay 3, have TCU, have USC stay 4, have TCU stay 3, and then have those teams play Michigan and Georgia just to get beat by them. Why not?
Yeah.
Why didn't they do it? That's why I have such a big issue with TCU being 3. Yes, you look at the 5, 6, 7, 8 teams.
No, just chill. You need to chill with TCU, bro. TCU does not
hate TCU.
But listen,
I hate TCU.
They're gonna get romped by Michigan. It's fine. Then you don't have to discuss it. It's over.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then that's it.
All right, now we have all this. Okay, now let's move on to the championship. We both assume it's going to be Georgia, Michigan, despite our differences in how they're going to get there. We're going to agree that Georgia and Michigan are going to make the championship.
Yes, all together. Wait, all at once. We'll both say who we think is going to win the championship. Okay, at
Georgia.
the same time. Okay, fuck you then, Georgia. Yeah.
I mean, what we saw this game last year, and Michigan is better than they were last year, and Georgia's worse than they were last year. So I will admit that. But Michigan's not going to be able to score against Georgia. If Ohio State's not going to be able to score against Georgia, Michigan's not going to be able to score against Georgia. Michigan is, I'm telling you for sure, Georgia's not going to give up 175-yard play at all. So Michigan is not going to score. Michigan had trouble scoring against Illinois, even against Purdue. They were kind of like held at the beginning of the game. Michigan's offense is going to have a ton of trouble with Georgia's defense, a ton of trouble.
Yep.
And Georgia's offense is Michigan's defense is very good, but Georgia's offense is going to do more than Michigan's offense, and Georgia's going to win this game. It's going to be closer than last year's game, but I still think Georgia's going to win by 10 to 15 points in that kind of game. I just think that Georgia is better than. I think the matchups are not good. I think that Ohio State can hang with Georgia because of their offensive talent. I don't think Michigan has as much offensive talent and dynamic. They're not as dynamic. So I feel like that's the reason Michigan will have more trouble than Ohio State with Georgia. But I think that Georgia's going to win. I mean, again, I could easily see Ohio State making the championship, and if Ohio State makes the championship, I think they can win it. But considering that I said that Georgia's going to make the championship, I think Georgia's going to beat Michigan.
Yep. You said it all. I think Georgia's going to have a more of a tough time with Michigan than they are with Ohio State. But yeah, I mean, Georgia's just gonna, they're just gonna really stamp in why, they shouldn't have been. Because remember, there was a point where Georgia wasn't the number one team in the nation.
They were undefeated and they weren't number one, and that was for a long time. And that's why I'm saying Georgia can be had. I just think that there's not a team that's good enough this year to challenge them. I feel like if Alabama made the playoff, it might be a different discussion. I just think that again, there was not even Alabama. I don't think Alabama would beat Georgia. I just think that this year there wasn't a team that was good enough to compete with Georgia. I feel like the Trevor Lawrence Clemson teams or the LSU Joe Burrow team would beat Georgia this year pretty easily. The Clemson team with Trevor Lawrence the year before that won it, they would have beat this Georgia team. I just think
Yeah.
that this year there's not like a very strong team. I feel like Ohio State can be that team, even though
Yeah.
they haven't given us a reason to prove that. But I feel like they can be more like that team. But I think that Georgia is the easiest, the safest bet to win the championship. I think that if we're gonna rank teams most likely to win the national championship, not win their semifinal, win the national championship, I think it goes Georgia, then Ohio State, then Michigan, then TCU.
Absolutely no shot. It goes Georgia, Michigan, actually no, it goes Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, TCU. I hate TCU. TCU shouldn't even be it. It should just be Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State.
Just have TCU leave, have Georgia make the championship, have Ohio State, Michigan play, and then I
Yeah,
agree.
I feel like Michigan should
Yeah,
just have a bye week at this point. Like
yeah.
screw it. But yeah, so those are our bowl game predictions. If you've watched, all four videos and you're at this point, then good for you. There's a lot. So
Absolute stud, absolute stud.
yeah, you're definitely a real one. If you're on the podcast and you're at this point, holy crap, like because it's been going on for a while. So we really
Yeah.
appreciate that. But for everyone listening and for everyone watching, make sure to follow us on our social medias on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find us at Dubs Only Sports. If you're looking to find us on YouTube or on our podcast on Spotify, you can find us just by typing in Dubs Only Sports. It should be one of the first things that pops up. Yeah, other than that, we're going to be talking about the World Cup finals. The stage is set for France and Argentina, so we'll be talking about that soon. And yeah, anything else you want to add on to this little outro?
That's it. We'll get into the World Cup tomorrow and have some more videos churning out in the
Yeah.
not so far future.
All right. Well, until then, be safe, everyone. And yeah, we'll see you in the next one. Peace out, guys.